Cool. All right, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining. We'll start off now. I think we've got a few more people coming online, but we do make for a 12:30 start. My name is Reese Hayes. I am the founder and CEO of IE Company. I'm one of the founders of Silicon Block, amongst other things. And I'd like to welcome you all to this, our fourth of the Silicon Block Virtual Fireside series. Of course, before we begin, we want to acknowledge that whilst we are predominantly a Victorian audience, we also have guests from across Australia and the world. So I would like to acknowledge that most of us sit on the unceded lands of First Nations people everywhere, and that we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes of their peoples across the nation and the planet. We acknowledge the particular risk First Nations people and all elders are in during the current COVID-19 crisis. Secondly, and as always, we should acknowledge the government's key message that the only way to beat the spread is to isolate and social distance. We're in this together and can only beat it with the cooperation of every one of us. And of course, a note that the Victorian government has extended the isolation stage 3 restrictions until May 11th, and that you can go to vic.gov.au for more information. We do like to ask a couple of audience participation questions. So they will typically be plus for yes and a minus for no via the chat back channel, or a rating 1 through 5. And as in terms of audience participation questions for Brad, ask away at any time. I'll keep an eye on both the Q&A and the chat for questions as they come through, and I will bring them up to Brad, or Brad might notice them himself. For questions in the chat, the chat is at the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Please ensure you select the drop-down options and select send comments to all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, they may not be either visible to us or to other attendees. And right, yeah, so it's now week 5 of restrictions, as I mentioned before. And so like it or not, we're all becoming accustomed in our own way to this new reality. The general sense I've noticed for most of us was week 1 was kind of shock, followed by a bit of a honeymoon of the novelty, followed by a sense we're all kind of now in with that, wow, this is kind of real. With school back and kids at home, we're all getting to know each other's homes, families and pets like never before. Of course, this is the world's biggest social experiment at scale and in real time, the consequences of which, both short and long term, are still largely unknown. What we do know is that for those of us that are knowledge workers, which is most people on this call, Zoom, Google Hangouts, WebEx and Microsoft Teams have replaced virtually all forms of business and social interaction. Here to discuss how we can be our best virtual selves, from the meeting room to the social meetup, and to contemplate some of the bigger social questions stemming from this, is journalist, author, speaker, old friend, and a presenting coach, as Brad reminded me before, Brad Howarth.
Hello,
Brad
everyone.
Is obsessed with I'll quickly just give you Brad's bio. Brad is obsessed with change. As a writer, researcher, and author, Brad has been examining the impact of technology-driven change on business and society for 25 years, writing for local and international publications, including The Australian, BRW, and developing numerous white papers and research reports. Brad has also authored 4 books focusing on topics including startups and entrepreneurship and life in a high-speed broadband society. His most recent, Innovation is for Everyone, sorry, Brad?
Yes,
correction there. So
keep going.
Innovation is for Everyone.
Yeah.
His most recent book was co-authored with Peter Fritz, AM, and provides insight into Australia's innovation system and what it will take to raise our capabilities. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Brad. How you doing?
Good to see you again, Reese. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. We were having a pretty good pre-chat now, so it's nice to have everybody else join us to get into it. I wanted to start a little bit to ask you a question. You pivoted your career. I wanted to ask you, first of all, just about your early career as a journalist and what drew you to journalism and what kind of helped shape your position as a journalist during that time.
I suspect a lot of it had to do with me failing engineering at university in my first year. That wasn't a particularly good start to my academic career, but I'd come through school doing math science and thinking that might be something I could do professionally. And got into my first year of uni at RMIT and as a communications engineer, I thought, this isn't going to work. But at high school, I'd actually, our school football team had got into the Sun Cup, which was like the championship for the schoolboys football back then. And I did the media liaison with the local newspaper so that we get the guys interviewed and all of that. And I got a bit of a taste for sort of the news environment. And the thing I loved about it was the fact that news changes so rapidly, and there's always something new happening. There's always something new to write about. So when I was reconsidering my horrendous mistake of trying to be an engineer and thinking what I could do that was as far from engineering as possible, I thought, well, journalism, RMIT had a journalism school, maybe I can talk my way into that, which I did, and spent 3 years studying to be a journalist, and thought I'd go and hopefully get a job at Channel 9 or the 7:30 Report or The Age or something like that, and missed out on all of those jobs and wound up at a small technology magazine which doesn't exist anymore. And I knew that my life had come full circle when I got invited to a press conference that was being held by the course coordinator that I've been studying under when I was doing engineering at RMIT. So I kind of just realized that I wouldn't be able to escape technology in my life. It'd be a big part of it. So years after that, kept writing about tech, moved up to Sydney, worked at The Australian for a couple of years, worked at Business Review Weekly for a couple of years. And I guess I've sort of followed, even after leaving full-time employment as a journalist, I've always kept my hand in looking at the tech space, because if you want to look at something that's going to have impact in the world, well, technology is the thing that is doing that, and it does it, most rapidly and changes most consistently.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back to the technology piece, and particularly what you're up to these days. I think it's interesting to think about, and I wanted to get your views on how, if I think back, we actually met when you were a journalist, and I think I was always hounding you from coverage or something like that. But
I don't think I ever gave it to you, but yeah.
I don't think you did either.
No.
Something about being in something under 30 might have popped up. But you have moved away from journalism, but as you said, kept an oar in. How do you, over the span of your career, what are your observations in the way that the role of media has changed and that industry has changed, and its implications for society?
Well, some of it's exactly the same. If you think about the role of a journalist, we report news, we tell stories, and we look for interesting stories. And if we can find interesting stories, then we present them to the world, and hopefully the world responds, and we get to keep our jobs. So that part hasn't changed, but I guess the way that we do it, has, because the tools that are available to us now are very different as journalists, but the tools that are available to citizens are very different as well. I mean, when I started off in 1995, people were barely using the internet back then. My first business card didn't have an email address on it. It had a fax number. World Wide Web was something that was quite brand new. I think Amazon had started up, like literally been going for a year. No one had heard of social media. There was no LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, etc., anything. And it was very much a publish type model. Now, of course, we have all of these social media tools, and people are free to publish what they want. So the barriers to journalism, I guess, have come down, and theoretically anyone can be a journalist now, because the access to the audience is, it's unrestricted in the way that it used to be. Previously, if you wanted to get your story out there, you had to talk to the media. Now you don't. And often the media is following what other people in other forums are doing in order to get the leads that we work with. So you've got that big change as well. Other critical point, though, is that there are sort of more journalists, at least from an amateur perspective out there, or more forms of journalism out there. There are also a lot fewer actual journalists around, because advertising revenue left the newspapers 20 years ago and went online. Newspapers weren't quick enough to follow. And therefore newspapers have got thinner and lighter and smaller, and have struggled to replace the money that was lost. And there's a stat that floats around that I can't verify, but it suggests that if you take all the profits that newspapers made between 1950 and 2000, it's equivalent to all the money that newspapers lost between 2000 and 2011. So you can see,
wow.
And then that. So big drop off. Fewer journalists, therefore a lot of experienced journalists have left. I still write, but it's probably less than 10% of what I do now. A lot of the people that I started with have transitioned to other industries. I've pretty much transitioned into doing a whole lot of other stuff in the training and research space. So therefore you've got these sort of huge demand for news content, and a smaller group of journalists able to provide it. That therefore, I guess, changes the things we focus on and the stuff that we're interested in.
I wanted to ask you about that, because I think it's just such an of the moment issue. We rely on, I just think now more than ever, there's this enormous schism between, there's a bailout, I think, for media outlets going through amongst all the many other bailouts that are going through. So that I know from other colleagues that work in media that the money is not flowing at the moment because advertisers aren't spending. But at the same time, probably everyone has a couple of browsers open right now, of be it CNN or the BBC or the Age or the Herald Sun or whatever your flavor is. We're all consuming information more than ever, because there's a very real need for the role of the media right now. And I just wanted to ask you what, in the context of what you just said, do you think that the media is failing us at the moment, or do you think it's keeping up?
I think that the media is doing the best it can with the resources that it has. I mean, everything you look at now is dominated by COVID-19 news, and so pretty much you can guarantee that most of the resources of any newsroom are going to be devoted to COVID-19. Even the sports journos, are spending all their time, will the Olympics be cancelled? When will the NRL restart? When will the AFL get back off the ground? Are we going to go into these quarantine camps or not? So property writers, they're all writing about COVID-19. So it's basically that one thing has sucked like 80 to 90% of media's attention in one direction. So whenever I see a story that isn't about COVID-19, like Malcolm Turnbull put out his memoirs, and that was reported this morning, and he's having a go at Scott Morrison. So, oh God, there's something there that's not about COVID-19. So that's kind of cool. But at the same time, everyone wants to read about COVID-19 and everyone wants to see it coming from what they've considered to be credible sources. So you kind of got that issue. But the problem here is that we do have newsrooms that are a lot smaller. The ability to specialize isn't there to the same extent that it was. And I really think that, for better or worse, the newsrooms that are in operation at the moment are doing the best they can with the resources that they have. And maybe they're not picking up every story. Maybe certain things are just dominating and sucking the oxygen out of everything else that's going on. But it's an unusual environment. We really haven't operated like this. And plus, you've got to remember that, as a journalist, one of the things that certainly when I started out, you wouldn't spend time in the office unless you were writing. You'd be out talking to people. Well, now you're probably working as a journalist at home, possibly on the front line of looking at some pretty ghastly news that's coming through on a regular basis without that same peer network around you supporting you. So, I've also got a degree of empathy for a lot of the people out there that are having to filter through this information, because often as a journalist, you get exposed to stuff that is a little bit more raw than what you might see coming through, once it's actually got into the newspaper or into the broadcast. And that can be, from a mental health perspective, can be quite challenging as well.
Yeah, it's I can only imagine. It's we've often equated this to a war, and wartime journalists struggle as well. But it's what we talked about last week, before we pivot on to presenting in a second. But What we talked about last week, I think, feels like to me that the information we get around the health status, obviously we all have limited access to that information, seems really well aggregated. One comment I made to you was, feels like the information about the state of the economy, which is obviously the other huge anxiety we all have, feels like there's a bit of a lag or a bit of inconsistency. It's hard to get a sense of whether that's accurate or not. I mean, for us working with our customers and our own business, I feel like I see more or get more information from that than I necessarily would even from the AFR at times.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, I guess, in terms of what's being covered. Now, the obvious stuff that gets covered is, major political announcements, infection rates, death rates, these kind of things, because they're the headline numbers that I guess everyone's concerned about. The economic stuff is getting, a fair amount of attention. There's a lot of reports coming out trying to understand, how deep is this recession going to be and so forth. Some of the stories that I think are getting missed are, the company-based stuff. We hear about a lot of organisations that are furloughing staff. I think the one I read today, Crown Resorts, has put 95% of its staff into furlough, or whatever the correct technical term for it is. But then you go and talk to your colleagues, or you talk to your business partners, or your customers, or your trading partners, and you sort of hear their stories as well. And it can be somewhat overwhelming. I think it's kind of hard to sort of really understand what's happening in the business world right now, because from a journalist perspective, we've only got so many tools that we can call upon, and we can spend time talking to people. But let's face it, if I was a journalist calling you up to say, hey, Reece, how badly impacted is your business? Probably not going to want to tell me, at least not tell me the honest answer. You say something light and fluffy, and maybe, I don't know, you're an honest man, maybe. But I guess the thing that hasn't come through yet is we haven't seen the reporting seasons, really kicking into gear. We've seen some organisations coming through saying they're downgrading profit, expectations and the like. And I think come June 30, and once companies start reporting, I think we'll probably really only appreciate how bad this got once we can see it in retrospect. Yeah,
I think, Q4 in Australia or Q2 in the US results are going to be really, really telling. So journalism, big part of your life, but mostly, as you say, 10% now. Tell us a little bit about how you made the move out of journalism and what fills your days these days.
sort of said before that one of the key things that journalists do is we tell stories. Hopefully we tell accurate stories, but be that as it may, we want to tell stories that keep people coming back. And one of the things I realized as a journalist is that our ability to tell stories is very much predicated on the ability often of people to give us something interesting to write about. And that sort of formed the basis of me thinking about, well, how can I actually help train people to tell their story more effectively? So that got me into communications training work about 15 years ago now. Really got me thinking about how can I work with people in order to help them tell their stories more effectively so they come across the way that they want them to. So that was one pivot. Because I like asking questions, I've also pivoted from doing journalism so much into doing research. I'll often work directly with organizations now. They've got a question or they've got a point of view or they've got something they want to get across. So I'll often get engaged now to do thought leadership type work. And often I'm then sort of doing both jobs. I'm sort of working out what this organization wants to say and then also helping them say it on the same time. Then because I've written a couple of books and done that kind of stuff, well, in order to promote books, the best way to do that is to get on stage and speak about them. So I got into the speaker circuit. And then that led me to thinking, well, if I'm speaking and I'm doing a reasonable job of it, and I'm also going to conferences and sitting in the audience and listening to other people speaking who are doing not a great job of it, can I take some of that communication training skill and help teach people how to present on stage as well? So they're sort of the main things that I spend my time doing. And then, of course, COVID-19 happens. So is it 5 weeks ago now? I have to check that. I need to put this date into my diary.
I say it's 5 weeks because this is the 4th week of this. And I think
it was the Monday after Dan Andrews declared state of emergency. And I had 5 events cancel over a 3-hour period. Like 5 of these events I was either facilitating or hosting, all face-to-face type things, and all gone. It's like, shit, this isn't good. And it got me thinking, well, okay, so what's going to happen now? And what I thought would happen is happening in that we're now doing a lot of this virtual kind of stuff. But the other realization is that if people struggle to present on stage, how badly are they going to go when it comes to actually trying to do the sort of thing that we're doing at the moment, where we're presenting virtually and where I can't see everyone apart from the fact that I believe they're there. These little messages keep popping up in the chat window. So now what I'm spending a lot of time doing, having transitioned my other training work to be delivered virtually, so I'm doing online coaching work now, is also teaching people how to present more effectively through a virtual medium. So trying to provide tips and pointers to people, just so that when they are engaging in scenarios like we are at the moment, or if they're taking a keynote and trying to adapt that into a virtual environment, that it comes through a little bit more cleanly than a lot of the sessions that we've been to, where everyone spends most of the meeting trying to figure out who's on hold and who's got the bad echo and why is it I can only see half your face because you're out of frame, or all the other rubbish that goes on.
Yeah, the excuses are starting to run a bit thin. I wanted to ask the audience actually. One thing I've noticed is that as we enter week 4 or 5 of this, that those critical meetings start to have to happen for lots of us. And I wanted to ask if you've yet had to attend what I'd call a critical meeting and deliver something important via remote or video conferencing. So that might be a pitch or a presentation to a senior stakeholder, a job interview, one of those meetings that you had to prep for, the kind of thing that gives you a few butterflies beforehand. It'd be a plus for yes or a minus for no to the audience. Have you had to deliver a critical a presentation yet via remote?
There's a few. What have we got coming up? It's a bit of a mix, really.
Yeah.
I mean, if you wanted to be a bit more direct about it, has anyone actually had to fire somebody over a virtual meeting? If you think about the things in life where you want to be looking somebody in the eye, that's probably about the worst I can imagine at the moment. Apart from possibly telling somebody they've got cancer, there's not much more you want to have to deliver that's going to be worse than that. But I suspect that, I mean, as this thing goes on, more and more of that is going to happen, and having an ability to, I guess, build up some level of comfort through these kind of mechanisms, it's essential. And one thing I will say about this particular crisis, Reese, is that we are all going to come out of it with a set of skills that we didn't have going into it. And whether they're skills that we wanted or not, they're going to be with us. And I guess what I'm curious to know then is, I was thinking about this the other day, because I spent a lot of my life speaking at conferences or doing MC work and that kind of stuff. And as a result, I would spend literally every week of my life, I'd be getting on at least one plane and then another one to come back, if not going to multiple cities. Yeah. And it's not glamorous, as anyone who does it knows. Now I'm looking at thinking, I haven't been on a plane for 2 months. I feel better. I kind of like that. And when things are happening again, does that mean that I will be getting on aircraft as often? Probably not. But the other thing that's going to happen is, and you'll possibly appreciate this as someone who's managing the P&L of a business, you look at all of that business that was done that required people to get on aircraft, and then you look at all the business that's being done now without people getting on aircraft, and you look at the expenses that are generated by that, and you ask yourself the question, do I really need to fly to Melbourne for that meeting, or do I really need to fly to Sydney for that meeting? And I think that is going to be one of the big changes, that people really start to think a little bit more seriously about what is going to be face-to-face and what doesn't need to be face-to-face.
Yeah, it's we sent about a dozen people platinum, but unfortunately for all of them, including me, all on Virgin. So we're hang in there, or else we're all unsecured creditors with our points.
Pass around the hat for that one, mate.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, as Lisa just pointed out, great for the environment as well. I think we're down 6% on carbon emissions, mostly through flights, apparently. But going back to presenting, you're obviously doing some work in this area now. What are the most obvious mistakes that you see people making when presenting virtually?
Not wearing pants.
Yeah.
Always wear pants. Number one, guaranteed. You're halfway through, you got your sweatpants on, and the doorbell goes. No, you don't want that. A lot of it is, I guess, technical. If you think about sort of the way that people frame themselves, I'm elevated my screen up to be eye height because I think it generally looks better to be looking at people. I'm kind of tired of looking at people's nostrils, and the one you were showing me before, when you're looking down on somebody's head, that's kind of weird as well. So trying to get your framing, yeah, that's the one. Gigantic Reese. You can't make eye contact because I can't see you, but I can at least imagine that I'm making eye contact with you, and I can do that if we're at the same line. So that is a good starting point. Getting your audio right. This is a bit of a test for me. I've just bought this new headset. So if I'm sounding good, then I'm happy. It actually takes a little while to order one of these now because everyone else has run out to get good headsets. But getting the audio right is critical. And particularly when we're doing video conferencing, there's a lot of bandwidth being chewed up, and if the video drops out, you can try to tolerate that. But if the audio drops out, then that's the end of it. So making sure that A, your audio is clear, B, that it's relatively free of distraction. I know it's impossible to be totally free, particularly when you're in a house with a family or a bunch of flatmates and others, but just trying to make that as crystal clear as you can. That's one of the critical things. The other one, or other two that I'd say are absolutely vital, are just making sure that you're starting cleanly. So making sure that you're online well ahead of time. One of the things that I'm doing when I run a webinar is, and Reese, you're doing a little bit of this, is when people are joining ahead of time, just sort of welcoming them, acknowledging that they've come in, saying, look, we'll be starting in 2 or 3 minutes, and just keeping a bit of a discussion going, even if it's just lighthearted banter, just so that people know that they're in the right room. Having a holding screen up as well somewhere, just so that people know they're in the right meeting. One of the things that I will normally do with a holding screen is put the rules of engagement on it. So if I'm encouraging, if it's a small meeting and I want everyone to have video, I'll have on that holding screen, please activate video if possible. I'll then just remind everyone to please put their devices onto mute. But if I'm wanting interaction, then I'll say, but be ready to come off mute at short notice. Just so that if you're trying to solicit Q&A, that people aren't, I think you're still on mute. Are you on mute? I'm not on mute. I've taken off mute. Oh, no, you put me on mute. You want to try and eliminate all of that kind of stuff as well. So just sort of setting the rules of engagement is critical as well. And especially, if you're running live polls, if you're looking for Q&A, are you going to be doing your Q&A during the presentation? You're going to do your Q&A at the end of the presentation, letting people know that as well. A few other minor things that I think work well, if you'll indulge me for a sec. Just the other thing I'll normally do if it's a presentation is set an agenda up front, so people know what they're going to be getting, when it's going to run to, when the breaks for Q&A will happen, and when it will end. And then really watching the time, because I've sat through a number of these things where people have invited Q&A halfway through, they end up down 15 different rabbit holes, and then they've got 5 minutes left to deliver the last 10 slides, and it doesn't work. So just really making sure that you're running and managing these things effectively. And the only other point that I'll raise, because I know you're going to bring it up, is just be aware of what's in your background. I've got a fairly busy background. I've been working from a home office for about 15 years now, so a lot of my my hobbies and various other predilections are on display behind me. This is just where I work. So for some environments or some kind of webinars, I think this might be a little bit too busy. I've actually got a green screen I can use for some stuff if I want to have a neutral background behind me. But always just be aware of what's behind you. And I always get nervous when people are presenting with an open door, because you just never know who's going to come through. And that day when the flatmates had a bit of a bender the night before and sort of doing the underwear dash to the bathroom, probably not something you want to have happen during a business meeting.
No. Importance of eye contact, because it feels very, technically I think I'm looking at you right now. I hope I am, because I'm looking straight at the camera, but it feels pretty unnatural for me. Is that important?
I think it is. I'm trying to look at the camera, though my eyes keep drifting down. So you've got to, my gigantic hand. So you've got to be a little bit careful of that. There is a degree of leeway that you get, though, from here to here. The worst, though, is when people are doing this and they're reading and there's no eye contact at all, as long as you're looking vaguely in the direction of the screen.
Yeah.
If I'm presenting something that needs notes, I actually have a stand set up behind my screen where I can put an iPad. The next thing I want to do is just set it up to be an auto cue, so I can actually scroll it with one hand without anyone realizing and just go through notes that way, because losing eye contact isn't so bad. If you've got to look down at your notes occasionally or whatever, that's acceptable as long as you keep coming back. But when people are constantly looking away, then no, that doesn't work. And the one thing I will note with any sort of virtual presentation is that if you're presenting on stage, it's pretty rare that people get up and leave, and you might have one or two and you're going to assume that's a bathroom break, because no one really wants to be the person who gets up to leave halfway through, because there's commotion that happens and people are looking at you and everything else. So people will generally be courteous enough in a physical presentation to sit through the whole thing for that reason. People don't need to be so courteous in a virtual presentation. People will drop out for any reason. Yeah, see you later. People will drop out for any reason whatsoever. So you don't want to, anything you do that's going to disengage that audience is going to give them a reason to think, nah, I don't want to hear about this. So try to maintain that idea. The most critical thing of all is to remember that there are actually people there. And I've done these sort of things where you can sort of tell the person who's presenting is just talking. They're not even really thinking about talking to somebody, or they might be talking at somebody. When I was putting the course together, I actually went back and looked at some of the advice that was given by newsreaders in the early days of television. And there's one chap, I can't remember his name now, but he was the third fellow to read news on the BBC. And his comment was that in broadcast television, you need to be talking to people, not at people. And I think that's an important lesson. I don't quite know how to describe that any better than the words that he gave, but remembering that there are people there, and even if you can't see them, because all I can see is this little black dot, there are 40, 50, 60 more people sitting behind that black dot who should be getting my attention in the same way that they would be if they were sitting right in front of me.
Yeah, it's, I haven't yet seen, we've seen a few really good business leaders. I thought did you see the Marriott CEO?
No.
He's amazing. He delivered a really heartfelt message. We can imagine the state of the Marriott business, but even still, and it's been held up as being one of the best examples, and this is a key one, he was reading. I guess we're not all formally trained broadcast professionals, but I did notice that he was reading from the script. This was really held up as an amazing one. He did get emotional towards the end, which carried it a lot. Yeah, what are your views on reading script versus engaging an audience?
Once again, I think there's a degree of tolerance that people have. Now, if you're going to see a politician deliver a speech, they're probably going to be using notes and they're probably going to spend a lot of time looking down. Reason being that speech was probably written 24 hours earlier by one of their staffers, and they're only looking at it for the maybe first or even second time in its actual format. So people kind of expect that, but provided the person reading does keep looking up, the skill to build up is the ability to be able to read sort of 4 or 5 words ahead of the words that you're saying. So you're kind of like a caching what the next few words are going to be. The worst thing is when you're reading and stumbling all the time and you haven't read it before, so you're stumbling over a word and that will break the flow. So people have a degree of tolerance, and particularly for something like the Marriott statement, like I said, I haven't seen it, but it probably sounds like a pretty important statement that probably had a lot riding on it, both in terms of what the staff would be listening out for, what customers would be listening out for, and what the share market would be listening out for. So you don't want to ad-lib that. You want to get that right, which means you're probably going to have to read it. But I guess if you can build up some of that skill set to be able to adjust the eye contact, particularly if the eye contact can go from up to down rather than down to up if possible, only because no one really wants to be in Chin City at the moment. You want to be, putting your best face forward. So that might help. But I guess the other critical thing is if you do have to read something, if it's something you're not so familiar with, then take a degree invest yourself in it. Do at least give it a couple of read-throughs beforehand. Know what the words are going to say. But also think about the fact that, people are going to be listening and responding to what you're saying. And I think it was Maya Angelou who said that people will forget what you said, and they'll forget why you said it, and they'll forget all this other stuff, but they will never forget how you made them feel.
Yeah.
You make somebody feel that you are not interested in them, or disengaged from them, or not empathetic to their situation, they're going to remember that. Yeah. So just, I guess, trying to bring forward your human characteristics is probably the critical thing to think about here the most.
It's a good segue. I think one of the most significant things is that we're literally operating in two dimensions. So we don't have all our senses that we're naturally used to in cultivating and engaging people. I've got my hands moving everywhere, but they're way outside the camera, so you can't see my body language necessarily. What do we need to be more mindful of when looking to engage and develop a connection? Be that with an audience of 1 or an audience of 50.
You can learn a lot.
You
can learn a lot. Sorry, don't talk over the top of people. Be one of them. So guilty. You can learn a lot from radio presenters. If you think, actually, one of the things, a lot of people are going to groan at this, but I remember when I was a kid, my dad was a cricket tragic. So we used to have a 200-acre block that we'd work on the weekend. And so it'd be me and him driving.
Sorry, a 200-acre block?
Yeah, like a small farm.
That sounds, it's more than a block, yeah.
Yeah, right. We called it a block, but yeah. So we'd go up on the weekend, and Dad was a cricket tragic, so we'd always be listening to the cricket, and it didn't matter what it was. So I spent a lot of my teenage years listening to Sheffield Shield cricket. And if you can make Sheffield Shield cricket interesting, that is a skill, because there's not much going on there. And, just listening to some of the people that get on and the storytelling, but also the use of intonation in the voice, making sure that if you were talking about something exciting, that you brought some excitement into what you were saying, and just, the really basic things that you'd probably do when talking to your mates, but which you often forget to do when you're doing something in a business context, because now you're doing business, so you need to be buttoned down. When people can't see you, or when they can't see much of you, they've got less to work with. So you need to give them something more. And I generally say that when you're presenting in a virtual environment, you kind of need to be you, but 10% extra. So just giving a little bit more of your personality, a little bit more of your emotion, maybe a little bit more of what you might be like after a couple of drinks, provided you're the right kind of drunk. I don't know, maybe that's inappropriate for some people, but just a little bit more than what you'd normally be, and make sure that you're using your voice to give them something to listen to beyond just the words that you're saying. You think about some of the great orators in history, it's the pauses between what they said which gave resonance and meaning to the things that they did say. Saying some things quickly in order to get a point across with urgency, but then slowing it down again to let a point sink in. So just these little things that you hear, newsreaders or radio broadcasters or other people doing quite naturally, see if you can adapt some of those maybe to your own presentation style, and just give people a little bit more to get hooked on rather than just the content of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I've really struggled with is when dealing with a lot of very clever people, but when somebody's coming at me at 1,000,000 miles an hour with a lot of information, it's just that little bit harder to register everything, I think.
It is. Pace of delivery, this has been my biggest problem as a presenter, is that I just want to race through everything because I'm excited by what I'm saying and I've got a lot to say and I want to get it all across. But the technique you have to learn is that the faster you speak, the less people are going to hear you say, because the words that you're saying are not going to sink in, they're going to bounce off the top. And if somebody's been interviewing people for 25 years, I'm pretty good at keeping up. But literally yesterday I was doing a call for a project I'm working on. I had to tell the person to slow down because I wasn't able to absorb what they were saying. So keep that in mind for your audience, that particularly when you've got a lot to say and you've got a very information dense presentation to deliver, that sometimes less is more. And you're much better off saying a smaller number of things that people remember than you are saying a large number of things that people forget.
One of the things I've started to do, and this can only really work for people I think that you work regularly with, is within our leadership team, we've got a lot going on, and we'll often only get half an hour bite chunks. And there's a big desire to kind of deliver all of the info. One of the things that I've started to go, you know what, I'll probably catch up with these people 4 times this week. So I'll just bite off a smaller chunk and effectively communicate that, rather than just try and dump it all on the table and probably get nothing absorbed.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea. And actually, this comes back to the presentation training work as well, is sometimes it's a good idea to chapterize, I guess, what you've got to say. So rather than delivering one hour presentation, deliver 4 15-minute presentations. As a presenter, that can be really useful because people might only be interested in 1/4 of what you've got to say. So don't make them sit through the whole thing to hear the thing that they're interested in. And especially given that as a presenter of what you're saying will probably be listened to a certain number of people live, but then by many more people as a recorded, you want to give them the ability to skip forward in what they're saying to that point. From a meeting perspective, yeah, it's a great idea to not overload people. But the other thing is to also give them an expectation of what you're going to talk about. And I think in virtual environments, setting an agenda for a meeting is really critical for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it makes it clear what you're going to be talking about, and therefore people are going to understand, well, maybe the first 15 minutes, what Reese is going to tell me doesn't worry me, but the next 15 minutes will. So I need to, maybe my mind will drift for a little bit, but then I need to be present for the rest of it and so forth. And it also gives people a bit of a time to prepare so that, they don't suddenly feel that they've been thrust into something as having been a passive listener to now being an active respondent. The other thing that doing and giving it, setting a very strict agenda does is it allows you maybe to time or, to pace things a little bit more appropriately. If there are a certain number of outcomes that you need to get to by the end of the meeting, make sure that you've got that locked into your agenda, and that if you haven't got to an outcome by a certain period of time, maybe you need to cut part of the discussion short or somehow do something else to get to the thing that you need. Because what we also need to keep in mind here is that, especially outside of your organization, everyone's going to be listening to us. They've probably allocated from 12:30 to 1:30. They could be on another call at 1:30. So if you're running overtime, or if you're, getting to that point where you're 55 minutes in and only 20% through the presentation, people aren't going to stick around. They're going to drop out. So try and do that. And the final point I'd also make is try and wrap things up early, because people do need to go to the bathroom and do all that other stuff that they don't otherwise get to do.
I find, so I'm bouncing from meeting to meeting, and I find one of the really awkward things is when I lose track of the time and there's something important happening, but I do need to be, I might be hosting the next meeting or something like that, and just cutting in and interjecting and apologizing for the fact that do have a hard finish. These hard finishes seem to be a lot more acute because you don't have travel time and you don't have to go anywhere. You just have to close the browser and open the next one. So you do run up against a minute, often not leaving yourself for the chance to go to the bathroom or have a breather.
Yeah, the other thing, and we were talking about this before the call got started, is that a lot of what we're doing at the moment, the brain's got a certain amount of capacity to process information. Some of us can do more than others. But we've all probably been doing a lot more in the last month than we would normally do, because we've got all of the work stuff that we've got to deal with, but then we've got what's happening externally with COVID-19. So, the concerns and stress that brings. We're possibly concerned for our co-workers or our families. If you're running a business, you've got all of these issues like, are you going to make payroll this week? That is just a huge problem that people are having to deal with on an ongoing basis. So our capacity to deal with the day-to-day stuff, which would probably be normally quite good at, is just evaporated, because we're running at 50% capacity the minute that we wake up. So giving yourself a break, giving yourself permission to step out for 5 minutes at the end of a meeting, or 15 minutes to just walk around the house, or half an hour to go for some exercise, it's critical. Because if we're just bouncing from meeting to meeting to meeting, people are going to burn out really quickly. And I'm finding this myself, that I'm not as productive as I used to be, because I'm just aware that a part of my brain is focused on stuff that it never had to be focused on before. So therefore, I'm sitting in meetings and I'm not retaining as much, because I know that my inner monologue is, thinking about the thing that I read about, the US pulling out of WHO or something like that. So if we're experiencing that in ourselves, have a degree of empathy for other people that we're talking to and what they might be going through, and just making sure that we're maybe being a little bit more tolerant, or maybe lowering our expectations a little bit in terms of what people are capable of delivering at the moment.
Here's a last one on presenting, and it's a big one, I think. I'm not sure if anyone in the audience has had this. I have probably 2 or 3 examples where I have met somebody for the first time in the last 5 weeks. So I've never met them in the physical world. I've never spoken to them before, but we are entering into an important, potentially in all 3 of those cases, an important commercial relationship. So I've really, really trusted new relationship. And normally you would, in all three cases, normally there would have been some wine involved at some point. There would have been a lot of, proper contact that helps to build that foundation of trust that gives you the green light to kind of pursue something that might have a contract around it. And this would be the case for people who might be in the job market. It's the case for anyone who is building a new big relationship, be that a new commercial one. Do you think you can build the same level of trust and intimacy when you only know someone virtually?
I think you can. I think one of the things that will come out of this is the realization that maybe some of the stuff that we were investing in, like, the dinners and all of that, maybe it wasn't as productive as maybe we thought it was, which is not great news for the restaurateurs out there and not great news for anyone who likes a great meal. But I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes a lot of what we do in business is the result of habit rather than the result of actually really analysing cost benefit of what we're doing. It's like I was saying before about the potential slowdown of air travel. Whenever I was doing communications training work, it would almost always be face-to-face. And that meant generally, because a lot of the clients I work with are in Sydney or elsewhere, getting on a plane. I've had some clients come back and say, look, very happy to do it virtually. We've run a number of sessions now. I can train people, I'd say 90 to 95% of it as effectively over a virtual meeting as I can face-to-face. Ran one this morning, no problem at all. And I'm hoping that some clients will now say, look, rather than flying to Sydney, why don't we just do this virtually and it will work? Because that's now happened. I've got other clients though who are like saying, oh no, we want to wait until this whole thing's blown over and we'll do it face to face. It's like, well, yeah, but you could be waiting 4 or 5 months for that. We don't know. And business development needs to continue. We need to keep being productive. Otherwise, sales pipelines dry up and other negative outcomes happen. So I guess to repeat the answer I said at the start and circle back though, I think we might find that some of the stuff that we took as being essential previously, we might start to reassess as not being as necessary, because sometimes it just isn't. Sometimes, are we doing this stuff because we really need to do it, or are we doing it because we just want to go out and meet new people and have fun? And maybe that's the case, in which case, fine, you won't be able to do that right now. But I don't think it means that that you can't build trusted relationships, because I'm pretty sure that people can lie just as effectively face-to-face as they can over a virtual meeting.
The only thing I did notice on that was I had one meeting where a couple of people were still in Melbourne, and I was the only person video conferencing in. And what a difference it makes, the one in all in versus if you're the only person dialing in. And it reminded me why I actually didn't like video conferencing, which was when I'm the only person dialing in, because you are at a deficit, whereas we're all on an equal playing field here at the moment.
Yeah, it gets a little bit Brady Bunch after a while when you've got like multiple screens coming up in front of you. But I think it sort of comes back to what I was saying before about rules of engagement for meetings. And I think it should be, if it's video and it's essential, then it should be all in if that's practical. Sometimes it's not. Some people, quite a few people I know of actually live in households with bandwidth constraints, or you've got like multiple people happening, or you just don't have the right environment. But otherwise, I think if you're going to do video, you're trying to get everyone to participate is kind of important, because the one or two that aren't participating, you can start to forget they're there, because you're really there or not. Actually, one thing I do in some of the sessions I run is I'll actually have 2 screens going. And one of the screens I'll have will be, if I'm running a presentation, I'll have that on a screen. And then I'll also have another screen, which is a second persona for me, with all the people's faces on it, just so I can sort of be doing both at once rather than trying to work with multiple different things happening on the screen at the same time.
Yeah, nice. We might leave presenting now. We've only got a few minutes left, and I wanted to just zoom out to some big picture pieces. But if anyone has any questions they'd like to direct at Brad in relation to presenting, either direct message him, or we could probably pick up 1 or 2 potentially in the chat back channel. You are, of course, providing presentation coaching, but you are perhaps better known for research and as an author, particularly around innovation and technology. Can't deny that, I might go to a quote of yours, which is that I've heard you say that change doesn't happen in a vacuum, and that when technology is widely adopted by people, that is when societal changes can really occur. We've been truly shunted digital, like it or not. This is probably the fastest and most rapid adoption of digital technologies we've seen in the past 30 years. I wanted to explore what your views of the consequences of this are, both the positive and the negative. And I might just start across society, but just that's a really broad question. So I might start with in business that we've touched on a little bit, but what really are the consequences that you're observing for this rapid adoption of these new technologies, not just the one we're using?
Yeah, one of the critical ones, I mean, is anything that wasn't digital is now digital, otherwise it doesn't exist. So whether that's online ordering at restaurants or video conferencing, or I got an email today from OPSM offering online optometrist consultations. And, you know, you're looking at the medical profession, which has been dragged forward by 15 years in the space of, you know, a month. That when that, you know, tsunami recedes, it's not going to recede all the way. There's going to be a lot of change, which is going to stay in place after that. And I think, you know, that might be good in some ways. There are other issues that come about of that. One of the things we forget at the moment is, you know, everyone on this call is obviously able to get onto this call because they've got the technology and the ability to use it. There's a good 10% of the Australian population who are not online. So people in remote and regional areas, people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, people with various intellectual and physical capability issues who are not part of this digital revolution, and their voices are not being heard at the moment, because if the entire discussion around society has moved into digital channels, well, then that discussion doesn't include people who are not in digital channels. So one of the groups I work with is the ADIA, the Australian Digital Inclusion Association, and its mission is to try and give a voice to those people who, for whatever reason, can't be part of this. So we need to have that consideration going on as well. And if we are going to move services online, then we still need to remember that that won't work for the entire population and not leave people behind as a result. From a business perspective, looking at costs, flights, accommodation, meals, all of the perks that people aren't paying for anymore, I think a lot of CFOs are going to be going through the P&Ls and spreadsheets very closely over the course of the next 3 months, not only to try and cut costs, but also to look at where they can, you know, keep costs down even after the crisis averts itself. The thing that most interests me about all of this, I guess, is the long-term psychological impact of what's happening, and that works on two fronts. Both, firstly, what is going to be the impact on mental health of this crisis? The last year in particular, I've seen a lot of research work, and I've worked on a couple of projects looking at issues of mental health and small business ownership. We didn't really get far enough into that to be able to do anything that's going to be useful right now, but I'm really keen to see what that people's mental health will look like come 6 months from now. And, you know, if the social isolation drags on much longer, that can really be a big negative outcome from this. But the other thing as well, I guess, is the opportunity that people have actually had to reset a little bit and to think about how quickly we have been changing and whether we're happy with everything that we've built out. And that's one of the things that really I was thinking about at the start of the year before any of this happened is, you know, we keep throwing technology out there and people keep absorbing it and using it, but we never get the opportunity to ask ourselves, are we any better off, or actually are we any happier as a result? And one thing that I have noticed coming through a lot is a lot of discussion through various forums about, you know, these linked ideas of community and connectivity and physical presence and mental health and everything else. And I hope if anything comes out of this, it's maybe that we do get a society which is a little bit more cognizant of using technology for genuine benefit rather than just for convenience or trying to make a quick buck.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that, you know, as I said in my opening, that this is, you know, literally the world's biggest social experiment done at scale and in real time. And I think we're a little way off. I wanted to draw you back just because I think a year or so ago, 2 years ago, when we reconnected, and it was a little bit over the work you were doing in rural and regional Australia in terms of connectivity. We touched on it before, and I really feel like what we're experiencing right now, for the vast majority of people who are on this call, presumably live in metropolitan areas, probably have fibre to the, not to the door, but fibre to the node or relatively good NBN. I can't remember why it was reconnected, but I remember complaining to you because I had NBN Sky Muster, which for those of you who don't know, that's the satellite connection that NBN provides. So you get a dish on your roof. Sounds great until you actually get it and you find out that it's capped. I think I can't remember what the caps are, but all I can tell you is that that Netflix left on overnight could drain it in one night. And I got frustrated for those reasons, being up here. And I thought about people who lived in regional Australia, who might be a family of 4 with 2 kids that were forced into remote learning, not because of COVID, but because it's the only way to connect into school, and that they would have to ration bandwidth. I just wanted to give you an opportunity perhaps to elaborate a little more on, first of all, what you already knew before this kicked in, because I don't know that it's particularly widely known that the digital divide sits there for so many Australians that don't live in metropolitan areas.
Yeah, it's funny. I got associated with this group and it's called Broadband for the Bush, or at least the precursor to the group that exists now. And it was very much around those issues of rural and remote connectivity. You'd hear stories about, there was one in particular, a lady that came to speak at our conference was talking about how her and her daughter had been out horseback riding. They own some massive property in Central Australia and they've been out riding. Her daughter's horse had been spooked by a snake, threw her daughter from the horse and fractured her shoulder bone. It also happened to be at a time when flooding had washed out one of the main road to civilization, which is still several hundred kilometres away. Their phone lines had been cut and their broadband had gone down. So her daughter's in acute pain for 2 days with nothing more than Panadol because she couldn't make contact with the outside world. And that's a very extreme example, but these issues around rationing out broadband, particularly for kids that are coming home from school and then their teachers are setting them tasks to do, if you're doing school of the air or these other things, yes, you've got concerns there. Simple stuff like the fact that you've got an iPhone and then Apple decides to upgrade the software. So that's 2 gig of download coming through overnight. And then a week later, they do a .01 upgrade and you've got to download another 2.3 gig worth of software. And then all of a sudden, a huge part of your bandwidth allocation's gone. So when you live in a city environment, you take this for granted, or mostly do. Maybe not everyone. I know a lot of people are still in areas that aren't particularly well serviced. And I guess if anything comes out of this, maybe we'll have a little bit more of an understanding of what life is like for people in regional areas when they do have to ration their broadband allocation. Things have got a lot better. SkyMuster, I don't know if you were on the previous system, but SkyMuster's 100 times improvement for a lot of people on what was around previously.
No, maybe I was on that. Maybe I should look at it again.
Yeah, there was another one called the Australian Broadband Guarantee, which was notoriously bad. SkyMuster isn't perfect, but it's a lot better than what people had, except for when it rains, because apparently the KA band doesn't go through clouds particularly well. Minor problem. I mean, not much of a problem for a lot of Australia for a long time because it just hadn't been raining. But yeah, maybe we will come out of this, I guess, with a little bit more appreciation. I would really want to stress that, as we move to a more digital world, we need to keep in mind that not everyone can come on that journey.
Yeah.
So hopefully, that might be something that people can take away from this. And if you want to get in touch with the ADIA, then, contact me afterwards or go find them on Google and I'll happily set up an introduction. A lot of their work is not just remote and rural, it's working with the homeless or working with people with intellectual or physical disability and the like, because they are a huge part of the Australian population. We don't see them out and about so much, particularly people in regional areas if we're in the city, but we don't see them at all online because if, that's where the conversation is and they can't be there, then they have no voice.
I think it's a really, really important message as we think a lot with compassion about our neighbours and our friends and our families that now more than ever, the digital divide is a significant line between social participation and not. And so thanks for raising that. I wanted to just finish on we're a little bit over time, so I just wanted to finish.
Okay.
What are you most optimistic about coming in the current moment?
I haven't put a most on it. I'm hoping that we come out of this, like I said, maybe being a little bit more considerate of others and what people have gone through. I think I've seen a real change in attitude towards mental health in Australia in the last couple of years and sort of stopping talking about mental illness and people with mental illness having something wrong with them to thinking that this is something that can affect all of us. And I hope that as we come out of this, the degree of self-care that we're practicing as well as the care that we afford to others lifts up as a result. I hope possibly that also translates through to maybe a downscaling of some of the overt aggression that we see in partisanship and particularly in online debates and bickering, although the toilet paper scenarios don't really fill me with hope for some of that. But I would just like to hope that, even though at the moment we might be more physically isolated, that perhaps it does actually bring us together in some way. And that is something that lasts beyond just everyone going back to business as usual come 6 to 12 months from now.
That's awesome. Thank you, Brad, so much. If people are interested in finding out more about your training programs that you run or more information about you in general,
just find me at brad@bradhowarth.com. or Google me and I should appear somewhere, or any other mechanism.
There's also but if you YouTube search there is a guy who does weightlifting that is also called Brad Howarth that has quite a few videos.
No, that's me. No. No, not me. No, I don't know anything about this person. I don't claim that at all. All right, yeah, I'm definitely out there. So yeah, happy to follow up with any conversation that anyone wants to have after today. And also just to say before you sign off, to thank everyone for listening in.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks everybody. It's great to connect again on Thursday. We'll see you next Thursday for the next Silicon Block Fireside. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, Reese.
Great to hang out.